Welcome everyone to Convergence. I'm Lauren Zafer.
And I'm Faisal Hoque.
So Convergence is a series dedicated to exploring the pivotal intersections of technology, business and leadership. And today we're diving deep into a topic that's not just relevant, but absolutely critical for every leader in today's rapidly evolving landscape. Now, this is AI tech literacy for CEOs. This discussion, it's actually inspired by Faisal's article, and it's the article for CEOs. AI tech literacy is no longer optional. Now, Faisal, your article compellingly argues that AI literacy is no longer a choice, but it's really a necessity for CEOs. So I'd say let's start by understanding the core problem you identify, and that is, why are so many AI initiatives failing to deliver value despite significant investment and enthusiasm, and how does a lack of leadership understanding really contribute to this?
Look, it's a very intertwined and complex problem, and it's a new technology, and any new technology organization and leaders always plays a catch-up game, especially if they're not technologists or doesn't come from a technology background. And then if you look at AI, especially, AI is so much more than just the technology, because it impacts the culture, it impacts how we interact with each other and interact with how we interact with system, and then how we interact with the customers, employees, et cetera, et cetera. So if you just unpack the technology stack itself, there's many types of AI. There's not just one kind of AI. Often enough these days, because it got so popularized by generative AI, especially consumer-focused generative AI, most folks think that that's what AI is all about, that you can talk to something and you can interact with something and it gives you an answer back. And you're really talking about the large language models that are available in public domain. But you can take generative AI and it could be enterprise generative AI. There are a number of other type of AI technology like predictive modeling, analytical AI, agentic AI. We're already talking about the AGI, which is the general intelligence. So those are various elements of technology stack. And then you can say, where does the data resides and whose data is it? Are we talking about public domain data? Is it my data in my enterprise? And I'm, as the CEO, wants to deploy and, kind of take advantage of that data, et cetera, et cetera. So it can get very elaborative. CEOs don't necessarily need to understand the technical nitty-gritty, but they definitely need to understand the architectural makeup of the AI landscape, plus also the impact of that has on the business architecture, right? So that takes a bit of thinking and stepping back and doing a bit of internal learning and external exposure along the way.
So you've touched upon multiple things that we can certainly dive into today. So I'm going to take a step back to the first thing that you said and one thing that you've emphasized at the end there. If we're looking at the CEO and their role, there was a mention of a technologist component, but you've also said that they don't necessarily have to be sort of an in-depth tech expert, but they do have to understand the architectural makeup. Now, what leads me, and it was actually something that I saw in the newspaper this morning. So this is quite a popular newspaper in Switzerland. It's called 20 Minuten. And in 20 Minuten, the headline today is that Swiss schools want teachers who understand artificial intelligence. And this parallels to the topic that we're talking about. So would you say that, and it might be quite a bold statement, but would you say that then the actual job spec when it comes to a CE organization has to follow this developmental push for understanding technology, understanding artificial intelligence, and really being able to say, this architectural makeup does not suit my organization?
Let's take a very simple example, right? Let's say I want to use, a chatbot for my customer care, and I want that chatbot to interact with a multilingual, multicultural audience, right? So in that context, you have to understand the audience you're serving. It's nothing to do with the technology itself, but the audience you're trying to serve, because if you're from Sweden and I'm from New York, there is cultural nuances and cultural differences. And so how you craft the chatbot to respond to a customer that's in Sweden versus customer in New York could be quite different, right? So you have to understand that cultural implication. Then you have to understand, well, what is that chatbot for? Is it that it's just looking up that particular customer information and suggesting based on the customer behavioral pattern in terms of what the customer may be able to benefit from that interaction? So that means that you have to understand the application of that chatbot, but you also have to understand the internal enterprise architecture that will be able to support that. Let's take a totally different example where you're saying, look, I want my processes to be more productive, right? I want them to be more efficient. I need to be more accurate, faster. And I want to deploy a bunch of AI agents that can be fetching data and decision support, et cetera, from different parts of my enterprises. And offload some of those to this automated agent. Now, what you're really talking about is a hybrid model of human workforce and a agentic workforce that has a different implication of technology utilization, the process, what it's supporting, but also the cultural and workforce impact because you're really offloading a bunch of work that's not human, that basically AI agent. So in both of those examples, it's really talking about a holistic architecture that starts with what's my business strategy, what's my processes looks like, what's my application that would be supporting those processes, and then what's the technology stack that will support it, but also the fact that what cultural implication it's going to have in my overall enterprise. So that's actually really makes up the whole enterprise architecture. And enterprise architecture is obviously not just about the technology itself.
And do you think that CEOs, and not only CEOs, but the organization itself, is at a point in the generative AI journey, as you've mentioned, we're looking towards more of an agentic element where there is automation and there is a necessity to analyze processes far deeper, that we're at a stage where there is certainty or guarantee that even those that are exploring it themselves can make the right decisions. I mean, surely that's a nuance that needs to be taken into consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the reality is that enterprise is not about one person. CEO sets the direction and provides the guideline, should be the cultural, the standard bearer that's basically driving, the learning element of an organization and experimental aspect of the organization. So it's not totally up to the CEO to keep up. It can be because then your business will fail, right? I mean, businesses is not about all AI. It's another enabler to make you more competitive advantages or other things, right? So the CEO has to put together the right team that basically keeps up with the changing technology landscape, but also you have to consider the cultural, geopolitical, and economic trend that we're noticing globally, which is as fast changing as technology itself. So it's really about creating that team that will be collectively pulling all this together. But the CEO has to be self-aware about the enterprise and the market that kind of brings these elements together and drives that change management process.
Is there a difference? Like if you were to segment small and medium businesses versus large businesses, is there a segment there where you have, or where you could say that tech literacy, this is a definition of tech literacy for larger enterprises, this is a level for smaller, medium, or is there no distinction and differentiation that is possibly exclusive or has no dependency on the size of the organization?
I think more than the size, what I've noticed is depends on the sector, industry segments, right? So if you are more tech centric segment, it doesn't have to be a tech business, but tech centric business versus, let's say, you are old school organization that's maybe in retail or banking. I can't imagine actually any industry these days that doesn't have heavy influence of technology. But it really depends on the industry. And I think the more they enable the businesses are with technology, the CEOs are increasingly being demanded of technology literacy and AI literacy. And again, the AI literacy, I don't mean just technology literacy, it's the application and enablement, and also the implication of culture and people. Because unlike any other technology, as you know very well, Lauren, it's not like other passive technology we have seen in the past. It has a dramatic and transformative impact, what you can do with it, both for good and for bad, right? So the CEOs needs to be very conscious about how they lead to bring this together and how they're pulling people together to make them impactful in the organization and outside of the organization.
Very much so. And I think it's the component of the implication on culture and the people. If we look at, so there's what you write about as well, the 4 AI horsemen. So this is understanding versus misapplication. And in your article, you meticulously outline the 4 types of AI. So you mentioned this at the start as well: analytical, deterministic, generative, and agentic. Now, if a CEO can't fundamentally distinguish between these, are they effectively equipping their organization for failure? Pouring a lot of resources into maybe ill-suited tools for the actual problem at hand. And maybe you can tell us, Faisal, is there a most common or damaging misapplication of an AI type from those 4 that we've listed that you have observed due to a lack of AI literacy? And maybe someone watching has seen this as well over the last 6 months or 9 months, I'm sure.
Sure. Look, the most talked about category is generative AI because it's all the attention it gets, right? Because it's every consumer, anybody who uses a phone or any device understand that aspect of it. So CEOs are at the end of the day human beings that are part of the society, and they're also influenced by whatever is in the media and whatnot. But if you talk about the decision making as an example, leveraging your on data. And even if you have a generative AI layer that basically the interface, you're actually using predictive modeling to say, okay, let's take a very simple example, a weather pattern for a farming industry. So you're not using generative AI to get what should be the weather forecast. You're using sort of a predictive model based on weather patterns. But you may be using generative AI as an interface to grab that data and kind of have that data communication, right? So the CEOs need to understand which type of technology can be applied for what kind of problem solving. And sometimes you may be using all of them together, right? And just like every organization has many function, whether that's supply chain versus human resource management versus financial management versus compliance versus marketing, you use different type of skills and tools and activities and whatnot to solve each of those things together, but you bring it together to kind of guide it in a particular way or navigate it to a particular way. So you as the CEO don't necessarily have to understand the exact predictive model logic or model that pattern that you'll be using, but you have to understand that, well, look, if I'm in farming industry, if I'm trying to help the farmers, I should be able to give them some insight into more than pattern recognition and forecasting. And maybe I use a generative AI interface so that a farmer, if multicultural and doesn't understand, maybe can't read or write, can benefit from that generative AI interface, right? But you're still using predictive modeling to provide that data to a farmer, as an example, right? So understanding that nuance is very important, right? And they have to be far more imaginative than they have been in the past, because if you're not, then you're really falling behind. And in reality, Lauren, the AI is not really it's not going to be the competitive advantage. It's going to be enabler. It's the imagination and innovation of utilization of AI that's going to make you competitively advantageous or not.
But I think this is exactly where it gets interesting. It's almost, as well as you highlighted, what type of tech can be applied in a certain sector. The example that you have given is very illustrative of that particular sector, but you've also got this whole expert trap of delegation versus direction. The CEO is for the direction, but you also, as a CEO, you depend on your team. And your team, in that sense, you have a team that is technically literate, larger organizations, much larger teams, but you're also delegating quite a strategic choice to technical teams that also sometimes lack this business context.
Yeah.
Well, and the question here, is it simply a lack of AI literacy, or is it also, the question around being willing to actually pass on that decision when those sort of teams don't have a full sort of profit and loss view and overview of what could happen if the wrong decision is made. So, what is the ultimate responsibility here beyond just getting smart on AI, and how can that whole trap be smoothed out? Like, where do organizations start? Where do CEOs start there?
Look, this is a age-old conversation about business and technology disconnect. We rightly so named this series called Convergence because it's really the convergence of many elements of enterprise that makes it successful, right? In 1999, I wrote my first book called E-Enterprise at the dawn of the browser and internet technology, arguing that technology models means nothing if you don't understand the business. Is the counter argument that you may be really tech savvy, but you're still failing because you're really not understanding the business aspect of where technology fits, right? So if you look at from that context, at that time I talked a great deal about strategic enterprise that basically gives a blueprint that anybody can follow how a business strategy connects to a technology implementation and then ultimately the value it needs to create for the enterprise. So, and that traceability and then and the common language needs to be part of the culture. If the CEO says, "Look, we need to have better customer care, and we think we can use AI for interacting with customers that are underserved because we couldn't reach that market because of language barrier or because cultural difference," you could do that with AI today, right? But there's somebody who is actually setting up that chatbot for that customer care function needs to understand where is it coming from and how does that impact the top line growth and the bottom line efficiency. If you don't, then now you're in a different trap of I understand the technology, but I don't really understand why I'm doing it. So it has to be both top down and bottom up alignment of wholesale strategy to execution to value creation. That should be, the mantra of the CEO. And if you say, okay, what's CEO's role in building that up? CEO, if you want to create that type of value, then you have to be the chief evangelist of that enterprise architecture. You have to own it, you have to communicate it, and you have to get people inspired behind that connected dots, and not just I'm giving board presentation and telling people, but I don't know what my engineers are doing and why they're doing it.
I think that's the point. If you go back to the newspaper, it's really this call, and it's the evangelism that comes with.
Yeah.
If you are using it, then and people in your teams and your organizations are using it, there is this call that you should be savvy enough to stand up and represent the positivity in how an organization should embrace it. There's one thing that we've not spoken about that comes into play, because not all organizations are build shops in that sense. Not all organizations have the capabilities and also the bandwidth to be able to build a system that they might envision as beneficial. What role does a vendor or a third party vendor play in this matrix? And if you're looking at the CEO, the business needs, the tech needs, and that whole spin cycle, where's the most vulnerable component of that diagram?
Look, I think that any organization, even a multi-billion dollar Fortune 500, which, I work with quite often, They need to look for outside partners that brings outside perspective, outside innovation, and outside enabler, because the world is no longer about your internal resources. And I've been saying that for years, and I think it has kind of seen this as gig economy kind of risen to the top. And you've seen a lot of entrepreneurial company built by very talented people. They don't live inside your organization. They actually live outside of your organization. So you have to be willing to partner with those folks all the way from strategy to execution. And you can create a model where you're educating your internal people, but don't expect all the innovation and ideas and technology coming internally and you'll be able to figure all this out, because that's not usually your primary role of the organization. The vendors, or whether that's a strategy consulting firm or whether that's a technology, core technology producer, they live and breathe that. That's a focus skill set, right? You're not going to have that focus skill set inside your organization. So you have to be able to team up. I will also add one other element to it. You almost have to look at technology itself as a partner, right? Which we talked about that. Like if you look at the next generation workforce, you're going to have human resource and you're going to have tech resource, which is really the agentic AI or other type of AI that's part of your workforce. So this idea of collaboration and partnership becomes critical. And don't expect everything coming from one vendor, because it's rarely the case who understands organizational psychology, understands strategy, understands generative AI, understands enterprise architecture, then understands how to track the measurement, the matrix of the impact. These are a whole lot of different, highly specialized skill set, and you'll have to find the right partners. It's like that hire the smarter people than you have kind of mantra that we often quote Steve Jobs. You got to get that smart people around you. It's not your job to be the smartest person in the room, but it is your job to grab those people so that you're driven by a purpose to execute whatever that you're trying to execute.
Yeah, because it sounds like it could get really expensive. I mean, one thing that we've not touched upon is the cost of all of this.
It can, but I would actually say that a lot of the vendor solutions and the people who are providing these kind of services are also being challenged to reinvent their business.
Mhm.
So I would actually say that the cost of accessing these resources in the short term may seem higher than other resource that you may access, but I think it's going to get cheaper and cheaper, and the providers will be able to provide a lot more with a lot less resource. So it's an industry-wide wholesale transformative challenge, because whatever is true for a business is also true for a provider, right? Because providers also have, outside pressure to be more efficient, more effective, and cost conscious. So, what you can without a doubt say that traditional models for the vendors and for service providers are long gone, right? You can't say, okay, I want to do a transformation, so let's go hire Booz or McKinsey or Accenture, and we're going to spend next 4 years and come up with a 5-year strategy and then execute it for 4 years. That model is gone. I mean, you have to look at it as like a 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 9 months implementation, and you have to build a foundation, right? And you have to be committed to long term. You have to be able to create that foundational expertise and foundational technology architecture that evolves with the market and evolves with the enterprise itself.
So, if we're looking at the foundational expertise component, because as an educator, I am an advocate for lifelong learning, education, and this particular development in society is a huge one. Now, a lot of CEOs, they're surrounded by board members, advisory committees, and sometimes I think that there is the possible trap or dilemma as to where a CEO can actually become part of an echo chamber. So, how does a CEO themselves ensure that their AI advisory network isn't just validating existing biases, but they're really trying to genuinely challenge assumptions and also exposing them to uncomfortable truths about AI's limitations and risks. As I spoke about, there's less talk about the price of exploring AI in the enterprise. It's not just about the cost of inference, of models, it's also the cost about operational resource reallocation. It's the POVs, POCs, will this work, won't this work? And also the exploration, as we spoke about, which type of tech do I need to use? And is this really solving the use case that I have possibly identified? There's multiple failures that could be business needs misaligned, but also the technical needs misaligned. Again, we could go down the whole road of which one's worse for an organization. But how does, if you go back to the CEO, how do they make sure that there's not this echo chamber?
It's a fantastic question, by the way. As we touched upon slightly, and we call this convergence. AI is really a convergence of multidisciplinary, multi-tiered exploration, right? So you can't just have a bunch of AI tech advisors. You can't just have a bunch of business advisors. You have to have people who are contrarian, questions ethics, questions compliance, questions human impact, questions long-term customer and societal impact, along with the business experts and the technology experts. And you're not going to find that in just one person. You have to really bring cross-disciplinary expertise. I mean, my own organization or the things that I do research on or write about, it's always cross-disciplinary because you cannot be an expert in every single facet of these things is trying to bring together. You may be even on the tech side, right? I mean, somebody who's expert in, let's say, large language model to create generative AI interfaces may not be an expert in, let's say, complex data science, right? Or may not be expert in predictive modeling, or may not be expert in the old style legacy enterprise technology and infrastructure that exists in every single enterprise, whether that's customer management, whether that's Salesforce management, financial management. You can't just all of a sudden wash out all that and say, okay, I got this generative AI expert and they're going to come and take my organization to the next level. So it's really a convergence of multidisciplinary people and expertise that you're going to have to bring together and have that contrarian conversation, because it's not just the impact on your enterprise on the short term and the long term. There's the human aspect of it. And any business that's not going to consider that, I would argue that they're going to become obsolete because the customer are going to reject them.
But how much does FOMO play in that? I mean, we've seen, I think it was 2 months ago in Forbes, there was a statistic around the fear of flaw strategies. So 70% of CEOs fear that flawed AI strategies could lead to their removal. So is there a genuine concern, or is it again down to the whole competitive P&L edge of commercialization? Let's make money. Let's be the best in AI. I'm not thinking long term. I'm thinking short term.
I think that most CEOs unfortunately don't think, the overall societal and global impact that will be created because of their business or because of implementation of AI. I think increasingly is being proven, this is not just with AI, that has been going on. The companies and organizations that focused on human impact, the focused on the well-being of whatever they're doing that impacts their community, that impacts their society in general. And let's define who those are. Those are your customers, right? So even though we argue that there's this whole notion of doing well by doing good is kind of passe and we overhyped it. Maybe we have overhyped it. But in terms of AI, it is going to have significant impact. Let me use this one simple example that I think we can maybe all relate to. I mean, we go to restaurants as an example as a social exercise in the sense that we like to be in public place so that we can be with other people. And I imagine, and we can already do this to a certain extent. Imagine the whole restaurant is now staffed with humanoid robots and they're serving you. That could be pretty daunting. It will have like an interesting rise as a novelty factor initially, but then it'll die out because you want to have human connection, right? So there is this notion of how do we balance that human connection with the product and services that we offer. And you'll see often enough people who get frustrated when they talk to a chatbot to get an answer, right? So I think organizations or businesses that are going to succeed are going to develop their product and services with empathy towards humanity, not other way around.
Let's hope so.
I hope so. I'm betting on it, so we'll see.
So this has been the first episode of Convergence. Faisal, would you like to add anything before we end this episode?
We've kind of honed this conversation around CEOs, but this applies to all leaders, small, big, and doesn't matter where you're playing a role in the organization, this conversation applies. So I call on all type of leaders to take from this conversation and apply some of this learning to their daily practices.
Definitely. As we've highlighted, it's no longer a choice, but it's a necessity for CEOs in the whole of the organization. Those that fail to educate themselves are the ones that are normally left behind in certain respects. So let's stay positive, let's stay aware, let's stay educated. And thank you everyone that's joined us in this conversation. Stick around next time for Convergence with Lauren Hoque Zafer, and
Faisal Hoque.
thank you.
Thank you.